All right, welcome in, everyone. You're listening to Bulls Central, and I'm joined with me today by a special guest, our very own Bulls insider and beat writer of NBC Sports Chicago, and the co-host of the Bulls Talk podcast. You also know him as the Young Goat. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show, Rob Schaefer of NBC Sports Chicago. Rob, as always, appreciate you making the time, and it's good to have you back on.
Hey, I always appreciate coming on. I think this is my third appearance.
Yeah, I think maybe even fourth.
So if you ever do like a wall of people that have been on, like those, like the laundromats and everything, sometimes they have the wall of people that have come in.
Yes.
I want a good spot on that wall.
All right, I'll do that for sure. Now, if you're not already, be sure to follow Rob on Twitter at Rob_Schafe. Check out all of his great work at NBCSportsChicago.com. Also subscribe to the Bulls Talk podcast. I think you guys just had one that aired this morning. I haven't had a chance to check that one out yet, but you get to hear from Rob, Casey Johnson, Tony Gill on a weekly basis talking about Bulls basketball. I'll leave a link to all that in the description. So, Rob, we're in the thick of the offseason. This is where things kind of start to slow down a bit, right? In the NBA news world, we've gone through the draft, peak of free agency, as well as summer league now being completed. Training camp won't start for another 2 months. We can more or less assume the Bulls are likely done making additional moves, but I suppose it's not out of the question, which we can talk about. But I did want to talk about the moves the Bulls did make. They re-signed Zach Lavine, re-signed Derrick Jones Jr., also added Andre Drummond, Goran Dragic on cheap contracts. I'm curious to know, what were your impressions of the Bulls offseason, what their moves were as a whole thus far anyway. I know in the Bulls Talk podcast, you felt that the Drummond signing was meh, right? But overall, how would you characterize the moves that were made, and how do you think it'll shape the Bulls for this upcoming season?
Overall, I would characterize them as, or just the grand scope of the types of moves they made were unsurprising, just in, like I said, kind of the gravity of them, only because the front office kind of kept their word when they said, we're going to keep the core together. They're going to prioritize continuity with this group going into the next season and make moves around the margins. So I thought Drummond, Dragic, two pretty good vets, two guys that have been around for a while that in theory address needs. Drummond, I think, is actually a pretty significant upgrade at backup center versus what the Bulls were working with last season. It was kind of a revolving door, and none of those doors were particularly solid in their, separate stints. Dragic, I'm sure we'll talk Lonzo at some point, but as an insurance policy there and, potentially adding some shooting if he is able to carve out a role in the backcourt. I think there's something there too. And then obviously, you mentioned the Zach, bringing back Derrick Jones Jr. I think that's a pretty good plan B they obviously struck out on Gallinari. You bring in a guy who, can play in your system, athletic, pretty disruptive defensively. I like the way Derrick Jones Jr. played last season. So I thought that was a pretty shrewd move at the number they got him for. And then Zach, the offseason has to be viewed as at least some level of successful just for bringing him back and not, if he goes out the door in unrestricted free agency, which never got particularly close to happening. Obviously, Zach, he didn't reveal that he didn't have a formal meeting with any other team. Right. But if that somehow did happen, obviously, the sky would be falling a little bit for the Bulls, given the way that they've built over the last few years. The Drummond and Dragic signing specifically, yeah, I thought they were all right. I'm kind of in wait and see mode with them. The big problem that I had kind of with the Drummond one specifically was it kind of cut against what Mark Eversley said on draft night, which that the Bulls were going to be prioritizing not only rim protection, but complementary rim protection to Nikola Vucevic. I don't necessarily see Drummond and Vucevic as a pairing that is going to play next to each other often, if at all. We've seen how the double big thing worked out last year with Tristan Thompson. Drummond is obviously a better player than Tristan Thompson, but a lot of the philosophical, stylistic things that made that double big pairing a little clunky, I think, would apply to Drummond and Vucevic too. And Drummond, I think can be solid defensively when he's engaged. He's always been a guy that racks up blocks and steals, got pretty good hands, but he's 6'10". He's not the most explosive vertical athlete. He didn't exactly fit the mold of what I thought they would be looking for in a rim protector, just athleticism wise, upside wise, potentially a guy that could play the 4 and the 5. So that's why I'm kind of in wait and see mode on that. But I think those moves do make the Bulls better, given that they pretty much brought back anybody that they wanted to bring back. It's just a matter of, did they get enough better to keep up with the, rest of the top of the Eastern Conference? Because a lot of these teams made pretty seismic moves in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, that was the biggest thing for me. It was not so much that the moves the Bulls made and being underwhelming per se. I don't think they were bad moves, right? You re-signed Zach Lavine, that had to be done. You got Derrick Jones Jr. on a cheap deal. Drummond, like you said, is an upgrade as a backup 5 compared to what you had last year. and you got a veteran point guard on a vet minimum deal. The issue I see is the rest of the East was much more aggressive than the Bulls were in getting better. I know the front office is stressed, again, continuity and wanting to keep the core together, and that when healthy, they are one of the better teams in the East, which fine. I don't necessarily disagree with that. We saw that this team was sitting number one in the East when they were healthy all the way through January. And even then they didn't have Patrick Williams. But it seems like, to some extent, the offseason moves are being rationalized around continuity and health as the reason for not making any big splashes. What's your perspective on that? Do you think it's a pretty big gamble to kind of rely more on the team being healthy and focusing on continuity rather than making, these all-in type moves that you're seeing from other teams? I mean, Boston Celtics made a big move in going after Malcolm Brogdon, right? I mean, just things like that. I think that's what was most surprising to me. What's sort of your perspective?
I think there's validity to the continuity argument to a point, because when AK or Billy or any of the players, when they say that the teams that they're going up against, the core group of guys, look at Boston, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Marcus Smart, whoever, like, go down the line. They've been together for a number of years. Jimmy Butler, Bam Adebayo, the core group that the Heat have together. Sure. You can go down the list and these are like, there is validity to the fact that you can't just overhaul your roster completely every offseason, as the Bulls did between, the end of the 2021 season and the 2021-22 season. Obviously, and that's what made the start that the Bulls had the last season so remarkable, was that it was a completely new group and they meshed almost instantly.
Right.
So I get where that overall kind of broader strategy comes from. The problem, I guess, that I see with it is that I think that the health gamble with this group is a little bit bigger than maybe I thought it was at the end of the season. It's mostly with Lonzo, just seeing the lack of progress on that front, by all accounts to this point, 6 months removed from the knee surgery. The bone bruise was obviously an issue for a while. Now it kind of seems like we're in a zone where I'm kind of assuming that the bone bruise is still a little bit of an issue in terms of him ramping up his rehab, but there also seems to be an element of nobody really knows what's going on with that knee. I think that's pretty concerning. Zach's knee, seems to be much more of a minor procedure, and by all accounts, he's going to be ramped up and fully ready by camp, if he's not already. Not too concerned about that. The Patrick Williams injury, I don't think there was a ton of predictive power in the fluke kind of wrist injury last year. I don't have like long-term injury prone, whatever concerns about Patrick Williams at all. So I think that's a reasonably safe bet. But the Lonzo bet, with how nebulous this injury situation is, combined with how important he is to the team, like, you could argue he's just as important, if not more important, as the three kind of all-star caliber players, quote unquote, that comprise the big three of the team. Like, that combination makes it a little bit more of a gamble than I'm comfortable with in terms of projecting them to be where they were at the beginning of last season again right away. Just because I really need to see Lonzo not only be available in camp in the preseason, but also be at 100% during that time. So I get where the front office was coming from. I just, and it's something that's a little bit out of their control, but the Lonzo dark cloud hanging over everything makes me a little bit skeptical that the continuity thing is going to work. Because there's a difference to me between continuity from, November through January Bulls and then the February through, the first round of the playoffs Bulls. Yes. If Lonzo's healthy and you get continuity from the beginning of season Bulls last year, you're cooking with something. If he's not, and it's continuity from the post All-Star break stretch last year, I mean, that stretch of the year was so disappointing for a number of reasons. And that's not a group that I would, want to have continuity with. Beginning of last season, I would. So I really think a lot of it hinges on Lonzo.
And, I was going to ask you about Lonzo Ball. It sounds like my answer, you've already answered it. Is any update, any status on what, is the latest? I mean, we keep hearing obviously that he's been progressing. I've got to ask, how concerned should Bulls fans be at this point about his long-term health? Not even just will he be ready to go to start the season, but rather, he's only 24 years old, still has 3 years left on his deal. Do the Bulls need to start seriously considering contingencies around this guy, which I guess, the Goran Dragic signing is maybe a piece to that, but he's only on a 1-year deal. He's 36 years old. You can't think about that long-term. So I assume no status based on what we've heard last from, AK when he was talking at the broadcast in Summer League. And, should Bulls fans be concerned?
Yeah, I think that was the most recent and most substantive kind of forthcoming update I think the Bulls have given, that one that AK gave on the Summer League broadcast. At the same time, it didn't strike me as all that surprising. He's progressing. Yes, that's That's obviously good. So we don't want to go like too existential doom and gloom here until we next see Lonzo or talk to Lonzo, see exactly what the nature of that progress is, but not progressing at the speed that the Bulls would like. I mean, that's been obvious ever since that 4 to 6 week recovery timeline was smashed and he missed the rest of the season. And now it's been 6 months since surgery. So if he's not back to 100% yet, then, obviously that would be slower progress than the team was originally anticipating. And then Casey Johnson, my colleague at NBC Sports Chicago, reported that day that Lonzo, when he ramps up his workouts, is still experiencing that same kind of discomfort in his knee. So again, it seems like the root cause of these issues is a little bit of a mystery, which to me, that would be, I think, concerning about the long-term aspect of this, because if we can't get to the root of it and there isn't a solution that is, being worked on intentionally, like to target this one specific problem, then I would be a little bit more concerned. I'm still not going to go DEFCON 5 or like red alarm bells, like everybody hit the deck. I'm not going to, say that the ship is completely sinking until camp / preseason. And this is a time when he is supposed to be on a basketball court and he's not, or he's significantly less than 100%. There's still a lot of time until training camp. So I think that'll be the next tentpole, the next thing to really check in with Lonzo on, unless we get an update sooner than that. But for now, I would be concerned, but not necessarily, the franchise is, flailing and it's up in flames yet. I think, we can wait a little bit longer on that, considering that progress is still being reported. But certainly a good deal of concern for his status for next season, especially, is definitely warranted.
Now, I know we kind of shifted with gears and talking about Lonzo Ball. I kind of want to go back to, the Bulls offseason thus far, because I do want to get your perspective on something as an objective sports writer, someone who isn't a biased Bulls fan, right? But the sentiment around most of the Bulls community regarding the offseason, the moves that were made, was that this was a very calculated approach by the Bulls ownership, the Reinsdorfs, in remaining just below the luxury tax line by not using the full mid-level exception they had available to them, which they certainly could have been able to do had they wanted. Historically speaking, I believe the Reinsdorfs have only paid the luxury tax once or twice since owning the team. You probably know that stat better than I do. As Bulls fans, it's frustrating, right? Because you see all of these other teams, championship level teams, that are doing whatever they can to make sure that their team is operating at the highest level possible. Regardless of the tax threshold, you have one of the most valuable teams in the league being the Bulls, and yet you continue to see them trying to cut costs even when they actually have the ability to be a great team. So I guess kind of a two-part question. Do you think that Bulls fans are justified in feeling this way? And second, do you think the Bulls intentionally ducked the tax, or is it just, it was a coincidence that they barely fell below the tax line with the signings that they made? And I should be clear, when I say they, I'm talking about the ownership, because AK and Mark Eversley, they don't strike me as the guys who would focus on avoiding going over the luxury tax threshold unless they were directed to do so.
Yeah. First part of the question, absolutely. I think fans have a right to be frustrated with that, because to me, like in the days when I was a fan and just kind of empathizing with that perspective, there's no reason for any fan to care about the owner of their team's, bottom line, frankly. I mean, as in so much as it affects like the team's bottom line, like record wise, like that's what fans care about. That's what fans should care about. So I don't think, unless, there is a realistic aspect though, where I think most owners in the league that aren't named like Joe Lacob with the word, like if you're interested in like knowing where your specific ownership's tolerance is or whatever, you could get invested in that type of stuff. But as a fan, I would never say that like you should care about, the luxury tax implications or the long-term financial, like it's not your money as a fan. So it's not necessarily your prerogative to care about the type of stuff. I totally empathize with the frustration. As for the Bulls specific luxury tax avoidance this year, I genuinely cannot say that I know whether it was a mandate, whether it was something that the front office came with a pitch and it was denied, or maybe the front office, there wasn't a compelling enough move that would have required them to go over, that they even brought it to ownership. Like, I don't really know the ways that, or the machinations that were gone through, before the salary, whatever, the team salary landed where it did. But they did end up under it. They do still have a lot of that mid-level exception sitting idle, which that would definitely frustrate me as a fan, because that's $10.5 million salary slot that, is unused, but could hypothetically have been used to improve a team that had multiple holes to plug. The one thing I will say, it does not appear that the Bulls' intention from the start of the offseason was to leave that unused, because I think based on is mostly KC's reporting that has eventually kind of, permeated throughout, national wise, it seems like their plan A was Drummond, Gallinari, and Gallinari would have been $6.5 or $7 million of that mid-level exception. So they struck out. And then you go watch the Gallinari intro press conference, and he's been a Celtics fan all his life, and yada, yada. And it's like, okay, well, shoot, did they, how much of a chance did they ever have? Right. And then you get to the question, would Gallinari have even solved all this team's ails? Like, probably not. Defensively, he wouldn't have necessarily been a fit, although I think he would have been valuable as a bench scorer, shooter. The Billy Donovan connection and the Arturas connection, because he was with him in Denver, would have been a big one. So I don't know where the buck stopped in terms of the luxury tax avoidance, but I would be frustrated as a fan by it, especially because, Mike Reinsdorf was on record this year on our podcast with KC saying that he would pay it for a championship contender. I would say, I don't necessarily, call me naive, I believe him when he said that. Now, that taking that forward, the only kind of way you could interpret that, when you juxtapose it with the fact that they didn't go into the tax this offseason, is that somewhere inside the organization, either there isn't belief that they're a championship contender, or they weren't able to pitch, hey, this last move will make us a championship contender. So they're multiple pieces away, which honestly, I think they are multiple pieces away, especially given the health concerns. But again, if I was a fan, that stuff wouldn't necessarily move me. It's just kind of a reality of things. The one thing I would point out, and this isn't me like caping for ownership or anything, but they aren't technically, ducking or under or avoiding the tax for this season until the season plays out and they never go over it. So sure. If I was a fan, the thing I'd be holding out for, and maybe it's fool's hope because of the team's, history with paying the tax, the thing I would hold out hope for is they get off to this amazing start and they make a big splash kind of mid-season move. And, there is more of a case to, hey, look, we are actually one piece away. Like middle of the season last year, I would hate it to overreact in the moment, but I actually did kind of see them as a second round, potentially like one break away from being a conference finals team. Like that's how well they were playing through the first half of last season. So that's the one thing I would say, like, it's not over till it's over. But at the same time, if you're a fan that is kind of disenfranchised or kind of, disenchanted with the whole thing, I wouldn't blame you for that.
And that's the thing. I was actually going to bring that up because, Casey talked to Michael Reinsdorf directly, like you said, on the Bulls Talk podcast, and he straight up said, yeah, we would pay the luxury tax for a championship level team. And again, it makes you wonder, do they view this team as a championship level team, which I personally don't. So maybe they don't see that as well. But I think that's sort of the thing with Bulls fans. It's like we've seen this thing before where, they've constantly been on, I don't want to necessarily call it cheap, right? But cutting costs where they can, because again, at the end of the day, it is a business, but we want to see the team be successful. We don't want to just kind of be in this perpetual state of, we can be a good playoff team, first round exit, maybe second round exit. You want to see them take that to the next level. Now I mentioned the Bulls are likely done, right? Making additional moves, but do you see any additional moves that might be made to the roster before the season begins? I know free agency signings are likely out at this point, but trades aren't out of the realm of possibility. What's the latest you're hearing around the beat regarding any trade possibilities for the Bulls? And do you have any predictions on what else the Bulls might potentially do?
Well, I know people would like me to say that a Kevin Durant trade is right around the corner. But the truth is, I think this is pretty much the roster. I think any kind of tweaking around the margins would be, if there is out of nowhere a training camp battle for a roster spot. They don't have an open roster spot right now, but if someone really, blew the socks off of the coaching staff and front office, like that's really the one kind of tweak I could see. They still have a two-way spot to fill. Those following those signings are really for the diehard fan, because those guys are kind of the split between the G League and the regular season. They're capped at 50 regular season games. They don't always get, or they're not playoff eligible. So that'll be something to fill. I did have my eye on the Daniel Tice trade exception, which would have allowed them to bring in $5 million in salary, but that expired earlier in July. So that possibility is, by the wayside. So I do kind of anticipate this being the roster. And that's why I really stress so much the importance of the Lonzo Ball knee situation, because that is really that. And then obviously like Patrick Williams' development and, Zach at 100%, is he going to be back to being a two-way player like he was at the beginning of last season? Those things are, what I would be focused on in terms of the team getting back to where it was at the beginning of last year. I don't see an impact signing or trade happening for the rest of the offseason. I could be wrong. things change in the NBA all the time, but I think it all speaks a little bit to, yes, the Bulls wanted to emphasize continuity this offseason. I believe that. They also were not the most asset strapped to do much on the trade market anyway. Sure. And certainly that hasn't changed now. And frankly, at this stage of the NBA offseason, unless you have a disgruntled star who's demanding a trade, you're probably pretty happy with your team and where you stand because you just finished making your bevy of offseason moves and you got your draft picks in, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a time that we typically see a lot of movement. I guess the only other transactional thing to watch for is like Nikola Vucevic and Coby White are extension eligible through the offseason. I don't necessarily expect, it's been kind of quiet on that front. I don't necessarily expect either of them to be extended. Again, that could change too. But that would be kind of the biggest thing to watch, as well as the training camp battles and that two-way slot. I don't see the free agents out there that are going to potentially move the needle that they would go after. And I don't really see a trade that necessarily fits for them either.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you about the, extensions of Coby White and Vucevic, if there were any rumblings around that, and whether or not they were actually going to be, negotiating an extension. And maybe it is happening, right? But from your perspective as an insider, if you had heard anything. And what about, the other kind of bigger rumor is Coby White trade rumors, which I think have died down quite a bit. Initially around the draft, there was talk about the Bulls packaging the 18th pick once it was selected to go along with Coby White. Do you see Coby being on this team to start the season?
I think he will be on the team to start the season. They definitely entertained potential trades, like you said, with Coby in the 18th pick. I just don't know that anything was to their liking value-wise. Coby's a really difficult guy as an asset because I know a lot of the fan base is super out on him and wants to, wanted, especially around the draft, to staple him to the 18th pick and flip it for some kind of upgrade, maybe balance the roster a little bit better. The problem is if you as a fan are looking at a player as expendable, an opposing front office is looking to trade for that player. That's going to be the first question they have is, why is this person viewed as expendable, especially going into the last year of his rookie contract, former 7th overall pick.
Yeah.
And, I think Coby had a better overall season last year than he probably gets credit for because of how poorly it ended. But that poor ending, that undoubtedly had a huge impact on his trade value. So I don't necessarily see him being traded this offseason. I think the window for that has probably passed. And I think just going into the season, he still is a guy that's, to me, going to be in the rotation. His shooting, if he can find some consistency with it, is going to have value, especially, say Dragic has a role. Hopefully Lonzo is healthy. DeRozan, obviously Zach, and Vooch, the offense runs through them a lot of the time. I think you could see him playing off the ball a little bit more this year, and they try to get his shooting and his kind of scoring into the game a little bit more as a bench piece. And then the thing I'd be hoping for as a fan, especially if you want to trade it, like, hope he plays well at the start of the season, and it's either going to be a boon for the team or, potentially something at the deadline comes around. Trade. Yeah. So I think, if the Bulls could have done something that made sense for the team, I think they would have explored a trade for him a little bit more seriously this offseason. But at this stage, it kind of seems like he's going to be on the team at the start of the season. And then, we'll see what happens from there. They obviously have his restricted rights at the end of this season too. Could just let the market play out there. Maybe there's sign and trade. I don't know. This is all super far in the future. So maybe that comes into play next offseason. But, in the next month or two, I don't necessarily see anything coming together.
Well, I think that's the biggest question for me is that, like you said, Coby is a good enough player that he is going to be a rotational player.
Yeah.
And when they brought in Goran Dragic, there's, rumblings about Dragic being promised 20 to 25 minutes per game. You got Io, Lonzo, assuming that he's healthy, obviously Zach, Lavine. It's a heavy backcourt. So from my perspective, it's for where are they going to find the minutes for all these guys? Because all of them are good enough to be in the rotation. It's not like they're going to be Matt Thomas sitting at the end of the bench, not playing anything. So that's sort of my biggest thing. It's like, well, they're probably going to have to find a trade for at least one of these guys, whether it's this offseason or during the season. But kind of a random question, actually, that I have for you. I actually asked you this last season. I'm curious to see if it's changed for this upcoming season. But if you had to pick one player for who this season is going to be the most important to, whether it be, Zach Lavine proving he's worth the max contract, Patrick Williams taking that third-year leap, the Bulls really relying on him to do so, actually. Maybe it's Vucevic or Coby White. We just talked about them being on expiring contracts. They're going to be in a contract year. Perhaps it's someone else. Who has the most riding on them for this upcoming season?
Ooh, so riding on them in terms of the long-term scope of their career. That is interesting. I actually think the answer who is the most important X factor wise for the Bulls this season and for the long term of their career, I actually think it can be the same answer. And I think it's Patrick Williams.
Yeah.
And the reasons are so obvious, right? Again, I hold nothing against him for last season because it was a complete fluke, injury, total accident, ends in disastrous fashion. He only plays 15 to 20 games in the regular season, gets some playoff experience under his belt. That's great. There were flashes, moments, as you know, everyone who's followed Patrick Williams' career is used to those words, but I don't really think he had the opportunity to string it together. If he does get that opportunity this season, especially with a full offseason under his belt, he could be a really, really big swing piece for the Bulls. Obviously starting at the 4, that's a thin position for them. Complimentary rim protection alongside Nikola Vucevic. If that could be Patrick Williams, I mean, that would be awesome. 10 to 15 points a game, playing off of Zach, DeMar, spot up jumpers, attacking closeouts, getting out in transition. If that could be Patrick Williams, that would be phenomenal. Yeah. And then even like one of my biggest kind of reservations about this Bulls roster in terms of projecting them as a contender is they're still, I think, lacking a little bit in terms of lineup and play style versatility, especially in the front court. Mm-hmm. Just when you have Nikola Vucevic anchoring a lineup, you're going to play one way, especially defensively. I really think if Patrick Williams was healthy for a lot of last season, we would have seen him and we would have seen Billy experiment with him at small ball center. That'll be something interesting to watch. Maybe that, it's not going to totally solve their front court issues, but that could be a wrinkle that wasn't a part of the Bulls last season, but could be this year. We saw Billy play small, through the early part of last season. Derrick Jones Jr. at the 5 being his most kind of notable experiment. You ran through the guard room. Like, I think the answer to that question with that logjam is they're just going to have to play super, super, super small. And Patrick Williams could be a key to that. And then for him personally, I mean, of course, going into the 3rd year of his career, he's extension eligible after the season. He'll be a free agent in 2 years. And again, by no fault of his own, I just don't think he's had the opportunity to build up a track record and, have these linear improvements and be able to build off of strong stretches of play. Really since his rookie season, which was kind of a trial by fire, like just jump right in, no off season, like you just got drafted. Here you are, you're starting 71 games. Right. So I think it could be a big season for him developmentally, obviously financially with all the, the business of basketball stuff, the extension possibility, the free agency coming up. And then for the Bulls, that starting power forward spot and just their general front court versatility, he could be a key to it if he does develop in the way that fans in the front office, in their most optimistic dreams could project him to. So I think he kind of fills both descriptions there, Patrick Williams.
Yeah. Well, and like you mentioned, the 4 spot, right? He's really their only 4 option. Alex Caruso, I didn't even mention him when I was talking about all the guards. I mean, he's probably going to have to play power forward like he did last season, right? So it's like, it's really going to be a big year for Patrick in so many different ways. Like you said, both for his future financially, but also for the Bulls' short-term success. I did want to talk about Dalen Terry a bit as well, the Bulls draft pick at 18. Most mock drafts didn't really have the Bulls selecting Dalen Terry, right? There was also a lot of speculation as to whether the Bulls, like we mentioned, would in fact trade that pick after they made the selection. It does now, in fact, look like the Bulls are going to keep Terry. Were you surprised at all by the pick, that the Bulls didn't try to package Terry for a more established win now type player? And based on what we've seen from Terry thus far in Summer League, how do you like the pick?
By the time draft night rolled around, I was not surprised that the pick didn't get packaged just because it did not seem like the trade market was unfolding in a way. Like, I know people really want a move to be made, but you can't make a move unless it's something that's going to work for the team, especially when the Bulls are as, kind of short on long-term assets as they are. Like the next move that they make, it's always the next move you make has to be a home run. So I wasn't that surprised that they kept the pick. I was surprised by Dalen Terry being the pick, and it's kind of classic for this front office. Just, the guy comes in for the rafters out of nowhere. All the names that are bandied about in the weeks leading up to the draft don't really have bearing. Now, granted, some of their people that were reported as targets went a little bit earlier. But I was surprised by Terry. He was a fast riser. I think he was originally like 2nd round projected. And then, as draft season went on, you get your measurements in at the combine, people go over the tape a little bit more. And then he was up in the 20s. And then obviously he goes at 18 to the Bulls. So I was a little surprised by that. But then the more you dug into him, the more I watched, some of his film in Arizona, and then you see him in Summer League. I'm starting to, I was talking myself into it even before Summer League, but especially after Summer League, I'm liking the pick more and more just because he does seem like a pretty standard 3-and-D archetype. And obviously the jump shot has a long way to go. So his work is cut out for him there. But defensively, I mean, I was really impressed with, the stuff that he was able to do in Vegas. I was impressed with some of his off the dribble passing. I was impressed with some of his finishing, the ability of him to get to the free throw line, to get out in transition. He looks like he really thrives, playing an up and down, up tempo style, which the Bulls obviously would like to play if they have all their pieces. So it's going to be hard to project a role for him coming into this year because, like you said, the backcourt picture is so crowded. I could see some G League, NBA split time for him. We said the same thing about Dosunmu last year, and look what happened with him. So, you always got to leave room for him to surprise. But I think he's a really interesting project, long-term project. And I know that's not what a lot of fans were hoping for, but the best player available draft approach to me it's always the smartest way to go because you never know what's going to happen in a year or 2 years. You just take the guy that you think has the most upside. And I think there's a considerable amount of upside with Dalen Terry. So it'll be interesting to see how he fares this year. And then if he can really pack on muscle and improve his jump shot a little bit, and if he could play the three, given how valuable and at a premium that position is, if you be a two-way player on the wing, that's so valuable in the modern NBA. The Bulls have been short on those types of players in recent years. So I'm into the Dalen Terry pick. I think at 18, you just take a swing at the most upside you could find. It's rare that you're going to find a star at that spot, but he looks like he could be a really, really exceptional, complimentary, star role player type of guy if he pans out right.
Yeah, no, I'm actually for the pick. I actually really liked what I saw from Dalen Terry early on. Didn't know much about him prior to the Bulls drafting him. I think, and my audience knows this quite a bit. I'm all about energy guys. I love guys that work hard, that want to get better, that want to keep learning. He strikes me as that type of guy. A little surprised that it was a project type player. Like you mentioned, you can tell he's not going to be, ready to go and be an immediate impact this year. Again, I also said that about Io too, but I think that was the biggest surprise for me based on where the Bulls are at right now, figuring out how you can get more of these win now type pieces. But I do like the potential that's there more in the long term. Rob, I'll get you out of here on this one. Way too early season prediction based on what we know today. Where do you see the Bulls finishing record-wise, standings in the East, and how far can they make it in the playoffs?
Let me pull up the Eastern Conference. If I do the standings projection. I think record-wise, the Lonzo thing is such a wild card that I have no idea how to project at this point. But record-wise, because the team is pretty similar to what it was last season, I could see the record finishing pretty similar, 45 to 48 win range, something like that. I would love to project them to be healthy all season. And if you could project the team to be healthy all season, the fact that they had such a poor post All-Star break stretch and still won 46, they were healthy all next year, I would easily have them as a 50-win team. But to kind of couch that, I'll put them in the 45 to 48 range. Miami, Boston, Milwaukee, Philly. I don't see them finishing ahead of any of those teams. So I have them outside of the top four. Brooklyn, who knows? Atlanta got better. I don't know if they got better than the Bulls, though. Cleveland,
New York might be getting Donovan Mitchell.
Nah, that's a tough one too. Let me put them at 45 to 48, and I'll keep them exactly where they were last year, 6 in the East. I think they finish above the play-in. But an offseason prioritizing continuity. I think maybe they could be a team better equipped to be more competitive in the playoffs going into next season. But because of how much better the rest of the conference got, didn't even mention Toronto, finished in front of the Bulls last year, and they certainly didn't get worse. They have a lot of guys that are developing. I'll go 47 wins and 6 in the East, something like that.
First round exit, or they win the first round?
Oof.
It's going to be tough to beat those top 4 teams.
I think it's probably a first round exit again. Way too early.
Let's assume Lonzo Ball is fully healthy. Would that change? Or would you keep him kind of in the same area?
So depends. See that, and that's the thing that's a little frustrating about the Bulls, right? Is they're a matchup dependent team, right? If we're on a Milwaukee Bucks podcast right now, it's like I don't care who they come up against in the first round. We have Giannis, we have Chris Middleton, we have Drew when they're healthy. Right. You're smashing first round opponent. This is what the regular season will be really important for the Bulls because if they can get into a home court advantage, I think one of those top 4 seeds, and they had Lonzo healthy, then I could maybe see them getting out of the first round. If they are outside the top 4, which way too early, I would expect them to be, I think it could be another first round exit season. And then, it's not like they would be in a completely deep and hopeless, dark place, but with, guys coming off the books, it would create a very interesting offseason next year, if that is how this season goes, because continuity is great, but if continuity leads to stagnance, then you have an issue. And then they would have to really take a hard look in the mirror at that point. But it's way too early. So we'll see what happens. And there could be a million superstar ask out trades in the East by then. And, that's what the season is for. That's why the games are played. But that's kind of where I see the Bulls as
it is way too early. Who knows? Maybe the next day or two, we learn that Kevin Durant is on the Bulls now, right?
No, well, that would certainly be something. that would change just about everything that we discussed.
Exactly. I don't think it's realistic at all. This could be a whole new topic, but I don't even know if it's worth gutting the entire team for Kevin Durant. But we'll save that for another day. Rob, as always, my man, appreciate you making the time. Means a great deal to me and to my audience. Keep up the great work on NBC Sports Chicago and the Bulls Talk podcast. And enjoy the rest of the offseason.
Yeah, you too, man. Always enjoy coming on.